Year and location: 1892, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. On the southern rim of Bucks County, hidden behind a corridor of tall hemlocks and thick stone walls, sits the abandoned campus of the Bavarian Mental Institute. From the road, it looks like any other relic of the Gilded Age: Gothic spires, wrought iron gates, and a manor built with the optimism of the new century. But the story within its corridors is stitched together from silence, missing persons reports and sealed county records. Between 1892 and 1901, 76 patients entered the institute and were never seen again. Their families were told conflicting stories. Their names slowly disappeared from census rolls and birth ledgers. And what began as rumors in church basements and local diners would eventually ignite an informal investigation that revealed what the state had tried to forget. The Bavarian Mental Institute opened in spring 1892, introduced to the public as a progressive haven for the nervously afflicted and emotionally maladjusted. Built with money from the Bavarian Relief League and sanctioned by the Pennsylvania Lunacy Commission, the institute was designed to replace crude county asylums with a more humanitarian philosophy. Its founding director, Dr. Wallace Emery, was heralded in the Philadelphia Courier as a man of science and moral vision. Newspaper illustrations showed sunlit gardens, tiled hydrotherapy rooms, and halls lined with books. By all appearances, the institute was an emblem of reform. Local families, especially those from German Protestant enclaves, sent relatives there in the belief that healing would be gentle, modern, and honest. No one suspected how long the corridors ran, or how easily names were crossed out. The Bavarian Mental Institute did not emerge in isolation. Its birth was the culmination of escalating dissatisfaction with the squalor of existing county madhouses, which had become synonymous with chains, overcrowding, and festering wounds. In the late 1880s, Pennsylvania had launched a series of inspections across its public institutions. Bucks County's own report from 1887 described unsanitary basements converted to sleeping quarters and one nurse to 48 inmates. Political pressure mounted, and when the Bavarian Relief League proposed a privately funded, state-sanctioned facility rooted in German medical excellence, the offer was seized upon by state legislators eager for both reform and campaign optics. The site selected was over 140 acres of wooded farmland just north of Newtown. The grounds were chosen in part for their isolation, but also for their proximity to the Philadelphia and Newtown Railroad line, allowing relatives to visit without excessive hardship. The architecture followed the Kirkbride plan, though with local modifications. Unlike the standard massive central block, Bavarian's design emphasized three distinct wings, one for men, one for women, and one for voluntary cases, connected by enclosed stone. Walkways. Photographs from the 1892 opening show smiling attendants, brick fountains, and a rotunda lined with gas lamps and imported Bavarian tiles. The imagery was curated, published widely in eastern Pennsylvania newspapers, and used in fundraising brochures distributed through Lutheran churches. Dr. Wallace Emery, the director, had trained in Berlin and Strasbourg. He spoke English with a Pennsylvanian accent, but often dropped into German when flustered. What most endeared him to reformers was his insistence that mental illness should be treated as any other illness, not as sin, nor as scandal. He wore dark suits, never drank in public, and lectured twice monthly on topics such as the rise of nervous disorders among industrial populations and the new science of moral recuperation. His reputation was spotless in those early years. No patients had yet vanished, no nurses had fled. In 1893, the Philadelphia Courier printed a full-page endorsement of Bavarian, noting the pastoral tranquility of the setting and the exemplary behavior of its staff. One feature especially praised was the garden therapy program, where patients tended herbs and grew vegetables. Visitors reported that meals were fresh and portioned fairly. The smells of burning straw and boiled roots permeated the buildings, but nothing more sinister was mentioned. A visitor from the Philadelphia Board of Charities described the institute as orderly, ambitious, and perhaps a model for the state. This optimism bled into the local community. In nearby Yardley, real estate prices rose. Stores carried postcards bearing the institute's image. The presence of educated staff and regular rail traffic brought a small wave of commerce to the region. Local farmers were contracted to provide milk, corn, and rye. The institute purchased soap and uniforms from Langford's Mercantile and paid promptly. Schoolteachers in Newtown held up the institution as proof that medicine and faith could coexist without cruelty. Sermons in nearby Baptist and Lutheran churches praised the arrival of God's mercy through modern hands. To the outside world, the Bavarian Mental Institute was not a prison. It was a promise. But some early documents suggest that the design had always included containment in mind. While Dr. Emery spoke publicly about open-air convalescence, the grounds were surrounded by 7-foot iron fencing topped with ornate barbs. The wings designated for unruly types had windows too narrow for escape and interior doors equipped with wedge locks. The voluntary wing was the only one with balconies and only on the second floor. Some of the patients listed as voluntary were sent there by family without legal proof of consent. Among early records, a curious phrase appeared on many intake forms: patient admitted with family's mutual understanding, a term that carried no legal weight but appeared to silence outside inquiries. In 1894, the first hints of unease surfaced, quietly. A German-language newspaper in Allentown published a letter from an unnamed mother who claimed her son, a farmhand suffering melancholia, had been admitted to Bavarian and then removed from all contact. Her visits were denied due to disciplinary actions, and her letters were returned unopened. The article was ignored by English-language outlets. When the Relief League was asked to comment, they replied that the woman had likely misunderstood her son's condition. Dr. Emery did not address the claim directly, but the next year, the institute began requiring all visitors to schedule appointments through an intermediary. Letters to patients were filtered, allegedly to prevent relapse due to agitating news. Several families in Bucks and Montgomery counties began to report odd behavior in the correspondence they did receive. Letters that appeared copied by hand, written in unfamiliar phrases, or lacking any reference to personal memories. Still, the public image remained unshaken. Annual reports from 1895 and 1896 glowed with statistics. The institute claimed a 61% recovery rate, one of the highest in the state. Charts showed graphs of moral improvement and patient stability. The language was euphemistic but effective. The average stay was listed as 11 months. The number of discharges rose each year according to internal documents, but no public list of names was ever offered. And it would not be until 1897 that the first official missing person case would be filed against the Bavarian Mental Institute. The 1897 case involved a man named Elias Rowe, a machinist from Chester County. According to county court affidavits, Rowe had been admitted to the Bavarian Mental Institute in April of that year, after what his family described as a period of mental excitability brought on by the loss of employment. His wife, Margaret Rowe, signed the admission form at the request of their pastor, who had encouraged her to seek care before the condition deteriorated further. Within 4 months, Margaret ceased receiving letters. When she attempted to visit, she was told her husband had been moved to a secondary facility for evaluation. No forwarding address was given. No doctor would confirm the transfer in writing. Margaret filed a missing persons report with the Bucks County Sheriff's Office in September. Her statement was logged and promptly sent to the Institute for clarification. 2 weeks later, the office received a handwritten reply from Dr. Emery, stating that Mr. Rowe has suffered a sudden cognitive regression and no longer recognizes familiar faces or names. The letter claimed that visitation would only disturb his progress, and that continued interference from non-medical parties might cause further deterioration. It was signed, sealed with the Institute's emblem, and included no medical records or corroboration from staff. When Margaret attempted to press the issue, the court declined to intervene, citing insufficient evidence of wrongdoing and the Institute's recognized legal discretion over treatment of the mentally unfit. Within 2 years, similar cases began appearing, not as news items, but as quiet frustrations voiced in town halls, church meetings, and local post offices. Names like Jacob Heller, Agnes Droll, Frederick Lantz. Each case followed a strikingly similar pattern: admission under family pressure, A brief period of letters or contact, followed by sudden silence, unreturned correspondence, and vague statements from the administration. When families pushed for information, they were met with a revolving sequence of justifications: early dementia, catatonia, behavioral risk, transfer to distant convalescent homes, or in some cases, death without detail. But no death certificates were ever filed with the county coroner for these patients. The first formal objection came from within. In 1899, a nurse named Leona Beck submitted a resignation letter directly to the Pennsylvania Board of Medical Oversight. The letter, discovered decades later among personal effects and now archived at the Bucks County Historical Society, contains restrained but disturbing phrasing. Beck wrote, "There are occurrences at the Bavarian Institute which do not align with my training or understanding of ethical care. I have witnessed the involuntary restraint of patients not for violence or danger, but for being inconvenient to the administration. I have seen discharge records falsified and patient ledgers altered." The board never followed up. Beck relocated to Trenton and never publicly elaborated. Her former colleagues at the Institute described her only as unreliable and emotionally disturbed. Dr. Emery responded with quiet fury. In a confidential memorandum circulated among Relief League trustees in 1900, he warned that former employees, aggrieved by professional correction, may attempt to impugn our reputation with falsehoods. He recommended doubling the confidentiality agreements signed by all staff and further limiting family access to patient quarters. The document, stamped internal use only, also proposed expanding the use of closed observation protocols for patients who, in his words, expressed dissatisfaction or paranoia concerning their care. None of this information was made public. To the outside world, the Bavarian Mental Institute still gleamed. The year 1900 brought a new obstacle to this cultivated image. A traveling Presbyterian minister named Elias Trumbell delivered a sermon in Norristown titled "The Silence of Our Sick." Drawing from personal visits and anecdotal reports, Trumbell suggested that the Institute had become a velvet cage for the unwanted, a place where moral deviation was pathologized and erased. He named no names. He cited no sources. But the sermon circulated widely, reprinted in small religious pamphlets across Pennsylvania. Some families began to wonder aloud whether they had consigned their relatives not to recovery, but to disappearance. The Institute responded aggressively. Dr. Emery published a full-page editorial in the Courier entitled "Lies Cloaked in Piety." He accused Trumbell of reckless defamation and deep misunderstanding of clinical realities. The Relief League offered a public tour of the non-restricted wings, inviting select community members and journalists to witness what they called "our dedication to dignity and light." The tour was carefully orchestrated. Visitors were led through garden paths, hydrotherapy rooms, and a reading hall stocked with Protestant devotional literature. One visitor described the experience as warm, if perhaps over-rehearsed. Notably, no reporters were permitted into the observation wing or the lower infirmary hall, which was labeled "under sanitation maintenance." Despite this effort, whispers persisted. In January 1901, a group of 3 former patients, all men from Northampton County, submitted an unsigned letter to the Allentown Ledger detailing their experiences inside the Institute. They described periods of forced sedation, cold water immersion for religious agitation, and being forbidden to speak with fellow patients. One claimed that he had been kept in a basement holding room for 5 days after requesting a Bible from his family. Another said he had witnessed a woman named Deidre Markell be escorted from her room during the night and never returned. No patient by that name appeared on public intake records, but her family, it would later emerge, had filed a petition in 1898 to declare her legally deceased. The Ledger never published the letter. Its editor, Franklin Stotesbury, was a long-time donor to the Relief League. By the fall of 1901, internal memoranda from the Bavarian Mental Institute showed signs of administrative strain. Monthly staffing reports included vague references to attrition, and requests for additional funding from the League began citing unexpected patient volatility. Yet the annual public report, released each December, remained glowing. It claimed the institute had served over 340 patients that year, with a discharge rate of 64% and only 4 recorded deaths. The document included bar graphs, sanitized testimonials, and a full-page photograph of a woman reading beneath a walnut tree. There was no mention of the 76 patients who had disappeared since 1892. Their names would not be compiled until years later, and only after the institute had shut its doors. At the time, each was treated as an isolated incident, a fluke of memory, or a regrettable but explainable end. The counties they came from had no mechanism to cross-reference admissions against unresolved absences. Some families moved away. Others resigned themselves to the explanation that their loved ones had become too sick to remember. The official registry carried on, uncorrected. By the end of 1901, the Bavarian Mental Institute stood as both a triumph of reform and a quiet reservoir of unanswered questions. It had hosted lectures, inspired donors, and symbolized a new vision for mental health in Pennsylvania. But beneath the painted tiles and manicured gardens, a pattern had formed. Names that once appeared in handwritten admission books simply vanished, leaving behind no graves, no certificates, and no acknowledgement. The silence would last another 3 years, until a stray property record unearthed by a curious clerk began to unravel the legacy. In June 1904, a junior clerk named Milton Price was assigned to reorganize land records at the Bucks County Register of Deeds office. The project was intended as a form of punishment. Price had filed a survey map under the wrong township and embarrassed his supervisor in front of visiting commissioners. His new task, as it was explained to him, was to cross-reference estate acquisitions with property taxes paid from 1890 to 1900. It was the kind of clerical purgatory designed to bore a man into compliance. Price accepted his assignment in silence and set about his work in the low-ceilinged records vault on Court Street. It was there, over 3 weeks and countless folio pages, that he noticed something strange about the land purchased by the Bavarian Mental Institute in 1891. The official deed recorded a purchase of 142 acres from the estate of a deceased Quaker family named Cartwright. Yet a separate tax register listed the institute as responsible for payments on 161 acres by 1893. The discrepancy was small, just 19 acres, but there was no documented sale, lease, or annexation to explain the expansion. Curious, Price pulled the parcel surveys from 1892, 1893, and 1894. He noted that the additional acreage consisted of a wedge of wooded slope bordering Jericho Creek, a stretch with no visible structures and no prior residential use. Rather than file a correction, Price drafted an internal memorandum and sent it to the county assessor's office, assuming a clerical oversight. He never received a reply. After 2 weeks, he resent the memo with a notation that the parcel may have tax-exempt status via religious or philanthropic designation. The response, when it came, was indirect. Her senior clerk named George Hellman visited Price in person, thanked him for his thoroughness, and suggested he take a week's leave to clear his mind. Hellman mentioned that matters involving the Bavarian Institute often got tangled with overlapping jurisdictions. He smiled once without warmth and left. Price returned from his leave unsettled. He began compiling a private list of names, pulling patient intake ledgers from the county hospital archives and comparing them with discharge logs. He worked in silence, often late into the evening. What emerged over several weeks was a spreadsheet of inconsistencies, patients admitted then unaccounted for, initials marked in pencil that never appeared again, transfer dates noted without destinations. Many of the missing came from working-class German families. They had few legal advocates and even fewer surviving records. No one seemed to be checking. Price's concerns would not find public voice until 1905, when he quietly passed a summary of his findings to a local historian named Everett Bronson. Bronson, a meticulous chronicler of Bucks County's founding families, had no formal investigative background. But he possessed a sharp eye for discrepancies and a well-thumbed Rolodex of county officials. When he began to cross-reference Price's list with church records and death notices, he noticed a pattern. Multiple individuals were declared deceased by their families without any confirming documentation. In some cases, pastors simply recorded deceased while under care with no burial date. Bronson submitted a request to the Bavarian Institute for permission to review their public cemetery plots, citing his interest in historical preservation. The reply, sent by Dr. Emery's secretary, informed him that the institute did not maintain an internal cemetery, and that all deceased patients were interred through arrangements made with families or local burial societies. But when Bronson visited the graveyards most commonly used for such interments, Laurel Hollow, St. Paul's Lutheran, the German Reformed ground in Langhorne, he found no headstones or records for more than 2/3 of the names he had flagged. Caretakers shrugged. Some remembered bodies arriving in unnamed boxes, others denied any knowledge at all. That autumn, Bronson took his concerns to the Pennsylvania Board of Medical Oversight. He arrived with hand-copied ledgers, annotated intake forms, and personal letters from 5 families who had lost contact with relatives at the institute. The board listened, expressed concern, and thanked him for his diligence. 2 weeks later, Bronson received a formal letter stating that, while the matters raised are of grave emotional resonance, they do not at this time warrant an official inquest. The letter was signed by Charles Penford, a physician with long-standing ties to the Relief League. Bronson never returned to the board. Instead, he turned to the local chapter of the Pennsylvania Journalists Alliance and convinced a young editor named Bernice Waller to investigate. Waller, only 26 at the time, worked for the Newtown Observer and was known for her sharp critiques of county infrastructure failures. She approached the Bavarian story reluctantly, aware that the Institute's defenders included prominent clergy and merchants. But after reviewing Bronson's materials, she agreed to publish a piece. The article ran on November 19, 1905, under the headline, "Where Are They Buried? Gaps in the Bavarian Ledgers." The response was immediate, though not as Bronson had hoped. The Observer's advertisers, including Langford's Mercantile and the Bucks Dairy Cooperative, pulled their sponsorships. Waller was summoned by her publisher and told to remain within the bounds of provable fact. A follow-up article was cancelled. Bronson was accused by a county supervisor of stoking suspicion among good Christian families. Dr. Emery responded with a letter to the editor in the Courier, stating that, Mr. Bronson's misapprehensions reflect not investigative rigor, but the paranoia of those who lack clinical training. He reminded the public that patient confidentiality laws restricted the release of medical and burial information. By 1906, the issue might have faded entirely if not for a single letter, uncovered by accident. A janitor named Ruth Kleinschmidt was clearing out the attic of the Bucks County Board of Health office when she found a stack of misfiled correspondence tied in twine. Among the letters was an envelope addressed to the State Health Commissioner, never opened. It bore the date February 1902 and contained a 2-page statement from Dr. Philip Kern, a short-tenured night physician at the Bavarian Institute. Kern, who had resigned in late 1901 citing professional divergence, detailed irregularities in patient intake records, including false names, backdated admittances, and instances where signatures did not match the handwriting of family members. He described one case in which a woman had been brought in under her sister's name and confined without proper diagnosis. The letter had never been read. Kleinschmidt, uncertain what to do, took it home. 2 days later, she brought it to Bronson, who published excerpts in a self-funded pamphlet titled Records of the Forgotten. The document circulated mostly among pastors, historians, and a few concerned citizens. But it struck a chord. A group of Lutheran elders in Langhorne demanded a review of the Relief League's financial statements. A Catholic Monsignor in Bristol wrote an open letter to the State Assembly urging pastoral access to patients of all denominations. Quietly, questions began to pile. But the most startling piece of evidence emerged not from records or testimony, but from beneath the ground itself. In early 1907, a flood along Jericho Creek caused soil erosion along the bank that bordered the Institute's lesser-known southern property line. 2 boys fishing for carp discovered what they believed to be animal bones protruding from the earth. When their father investigated, he unearthed what appeared to be a partially collapsed trench filled with decomposed wooden planks and fragments of what he described as cloth sacks tied with iron cord. The local sheriff sealed off the area. The remains were never officially identified. A brief note in the March 1907 issue of the Newtown Weekly Bulletin mentioned unconfirmed discovery of bones, likely livestock, from flood damage near the Bavarian grounds. No further inquiry was made, but those who had been watching closely understood what had been found, and some, like Bronson, began to prepare for a more direct confrontation. In the weeks following the flood at Jericho Creek, the atmosphere in Newtown shifted. Rumors once confined to supper tables and back pews began appearing in coded language within church bulletins and agricultural newsletters. One such line, buried in a column about spring planting, read, "Let no roots rot in silence, for even the forgotten have soil that remembers." Local clergy began referencing the concept of institutional sin without naming the institute. At the Bavarian campus, visitors were still permitted by appointment, but more families found their requests denied due to seasonal health protocols. Dr. Emery, sensing the ground shifting, convened a gathering of Relief League trustees in April 1907. Meeting minutes from that session, later obtained through a legal request in 1912, reveal a director no longer confident in silence. Emery reportedly urged the board to consider a controlled audit for public assurance, and suggested that an external panel of physicians could be invited to review patient outcomes. His tone, according to the record, was one of stern management rather than panic. However, not all trustees agreed. Some believed that any audit, no matter how restricted, would be interpreted as an admission of past failures. Instead, they settled on a compromise. A report would be commissioned, authored by the Institute itself, outlining its treatment methods, recovery statistics, and ongoing improvements. It would include photographs, patient testimonials, sourced only from voluntary discharges, and endorsements from affiliated clergy. The report, titled 10 Years of Dignified Care, was published in June and distributed throughout Bucks County libraries, schools, and churches. Its tone was polished, its layout immaculate, and its language unmistakably curated. Notably, the document made no reference to burial practices or patient mortality rates. Meanwhile, Everett Bronson continued his own quiet inquiry. Working with Bernice Waller, who had since left the Observer to freelance for medical periodicals, he drafted a dossier intended for the Pennsylvania State Attorney's Office. The dossier included sworn letters from 7 families, copies of Milton Price's early ledgers, excerpts from Dr. Philip Kern's suppressed letter, and an affidavit from a groundskeeper who claimed to have been instructed not to answer if holes were dug near the southern ravine. The file was thick with circumstantial evidence, but lacked a singular, confirmable act of misconduct that would compel state intervention. They knew they needed something irrefutable. It arrived, ironically, through an accident of carelessness. A retired nurse named Helen Arlo, once employed briefly in 1896 at the Bavarian Infirmary, passed away in the summer of 1907. Her estate was modest. Among her effects passed to a cousin were 2 patient intake ledgers that had been tucked into her sewing trunk. The ledgers covered the period from March to August 1896. They listed 61 names with admission dates, diagnoses, and family notations. But next to 11 of those names, someone had scrawled a curious abbreviation, NV, no return. The same abbreviation appeared again and again, always in the same faded pencil. None of the names with NV beside them appeared in discharge lists. None were mentioned in burial entries. One of the patients, a woman named Clara Wentz, had been the subject of a missing persons report in 1898. Her name had been dismissed as never formally admitted. Bronson and Waller took the ledgers directly to state officials. This time they were not dismissed. The attorney's office opened an inquiry, discreetly at first, issuing subpoenas for internal institute documents and requesting interviews with former staff. But word spread quickly. By autumn, whispers of the ledger evidence had reached church circles, taverns, and even local election debates. The Relief League went into defensive posture. Public statements emphasized that all medical institutions experienced turnover, and that no institution could account for every discharged case when families refused to engage. Dr. Emery ceased public appearances. In October, a judge approved a preliminary review of the Institute's burial protocols. Investigators arrived at the Bavarian grounds on a cold morning and were escorted by 2 senior staff through the property. When asked to identify designated burial plots or contracts with local cemeteries, the staff produced a list of names supposedly interred at various churchyards. Investigators called each one. Not a single burial could be confirmed. One church secretary remarked that the name she was given had never appeared on any stone or in any funeral registry. Pressed further, the Institute offered a new explanation. In the 1890s, it had briefly operated a private crematorium on the grounds, which had since been dismantled. No records of its operation could be located. No ash remains could be produced. When asked for documentation of state approval for the cremation practice, the staff demurred, stating that early cremation processes were handled in-house during an era of looser regulation. That statement marked a turning point. The following week, the Attorney General's office formally opened a misconduct investigation into the Bavarian Mental Institute. The inquiry focused on record tampering, possible unlawful confinement, and the unlicensed disposal of human remains. News of the investigation made front-page headlines in Philadelphia and Allentown. For the first time, families began coming forward publicly. Testimonies poured in, describing relatives who vanished, letters that changed handwriting mid-sentence, and doctors who dismissed questions with medical jargon that confused rather than clarified. But amid this growing wave of scrutiny, the Institute still had defenders. Several Protestant leaders published editorials in its defense, warning of a rising hysteria threatening the credibility of charitable science. Letters appeared in local papers, accusing Bronson and Waller of exploiting grief for notoriety. One trustee referred to them privately as parish ghouls preying on collective unease. A small rally was held in Newtown by supporters of the Relief League, carrying signs that read "Trust in Mercy" and "Science Above Suspicion." The rally lasted less than 2 hours. By winter, state officials had returned to the southern border of the Institute's property. Under warrant, they began a formal excavation near the area disturbed by the Jericho Creek flood. The initial dig revealed decayed remnants of pine coffins, several broken, some bound in what remained of canvas wrappings. Soil tests confirmed the presence of human remains in varying stages of decomposition. No markers were found. No registry matched the graves. Officials halted the dig due to frost, planning to resume in spring. That spring would never come for the Institute. In February 1908, the Relief League announced it would temporarily suspend operations at the Bavarian Mental Institute pending a full review. Patients were relocated to other facilities across the state. Dr. Emery retired without formal statement. His final recorded appearance was at a private club dinner in Philadelphia, where he was toasted as a man of pioneering vision. The Institute's buildings were shuttered, windows boarded, wings locked. Guards were posted briefly, then withdrawn. The land stood quiet, but the questions refused to die. The spring thaw of 1908 exposed more than just softened soil. When excavation crews returned to the slope overlooking Jericho Creek, they brought with them coroner's deputies, a forensic examiner from Philadelphia, and 2 stenographers dispatched by the Attorney General's office. A tent was erected beside the dig, and a chain of canvas screens was set up to shield the work from public view. But word had spread. Locals gathered on the opposite bank. Children climbed trees for vantage. Each hour a new rumor bloomed. The bodies were tied together, the coffins reused, the ground salted to hide stench. The truth, as the coroner later wrote, was worse in its banality. 17 graves were uncovered in the first week. None had caskets intact. Most remains were shrouded in what appeared to be repurposed bedding, fastened with thick iron twine. Bone fragments indicated improper positioning, as if the bodies had been folded or forced into spaces too narrow for natural repose. In several graves, multiple individuals had been buried together without partition. Dental records, where available, confirmed that none of the deceased had been registered with local death certificates. A jawbone recovered from the third trench matched the profile of a woman named Ilse Weber, admitted to the Bavarian Institute in 1895 after her husband's death. Her family had received a discharge letter in 1896, claiming she had moved to Ohio to work as a housemaid. No such employment had ever existed. The coroner's initial report concluded that the burial method lacked medical sanitation, professional handling, or lawful documentation. Yet it stopped short of declaring the deaths as homicides. This distinction incensed the families of the missing. Public forums, long confined to gossip, now exploded into accusation. Town meetings became stages for anguish. Men stood with trembling hands, reading aloud letters they had received from the Institute years earlier, now recognized as fabrications. Women sobbed while describing the months they had been told to remain calm by trustees. A teacher from Falls Township recounted how her cousin had vanished after being admitted for hysterical weeping. She had been told the girl had married a railroad foreman and moved west. The girl's jawbone was found in grave 5. By May, the Attorney General's office issued its formal findings. The Bavarian Mental Institute had committed multiple counts of unlawful disposal of human remains, failure to report patient deaths, and obstruction of state health records. The report named Dr. Wallace Emery as the administrator responsible during the period in question, but the language remained clinical, the tone dispassionate. Words like negligence, oversight, systemic breakdown were used in place of cruelty, abuse, or malice. It was, in the end, a report designed for files, not families. The decision not to pursue criminal charges against Emery caused a wave of protest. Families marched from Langhorne to Doylestown. Churches rang their bells at irregular hours in mourning. A group of Quaker elders attempted to meet with the governor, demanding accountability. He declined, citing the need for ongoing legal integrity. Meanwhile, Emery remained secluded in Philadelphia, shielded by former trustees and medical colleagues. A brief interview conducted by the Courier revealed a man worn but unrepentant. When asked about the unmarked graves, he replied, "Those who worked within those walls knew the limitations we faced. Not every soul can be saved, nor documented." That spring, a second excavation site was uncovered. This time it lay beneath what had once been the Institute's root cellar, a structure used for food storage during its peak operation. The cellar had collapsed in the early 1900s and been sealed without investigation. When workers removed the foundation stones, they discovered 6 more sets of remains. Unlike the others, these had no wrappings. They were buried directly into soil, bodies side by side, heads turned inward. One skeleton showed evidence of bound wrists. Another had a fractured clavicle, likely incurred before death. Forensic reports suggested the injuries were not the result of collapse, but consistent with physical restraint or impact. It was at this point that the investigation's tone began to shift. What had been framed as institutional negligence now strained towards something more deliberate. The State Medical Examiner's Office reopened testimonies from former staff, including a brief statement submitted anonymously in 1901 that described unofficial rooms used for containment not on the architectural maps. Investigators turned to blueprints of the original structure. What they found was a series of inconsistencies. The official plans approved by the Relief League in 1891 showed 3 patient wings, administrative offices, and a chapel. But several inspection maps drawn during construction revealed an additional sublevel beneath the western wing. The sublevel was never acknowledged in any public record. A team of contractors was brought in to survey the western foundation. It took them 2 days to identify the sealed stairwell, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall. When the wall was breached, a narrow stone stair descended into darkness. The passage smelled of damp plaster and rot. At the bottom lay a corridor with 5 adjoining rooms, each no larger than a janitor's closet. Iron loops were fixed into the walls. The floors showed marks where furniture had once stood. But no beds, no blankets, no medical tools remained. Only one item was found intact, a metal tag nailed to the interior of a door. It read, "Unit C, Retention Hold." Reporters were not allowed into the corridor. No photographs were published. But the existence of the sublevel was confirmed by state officials and entered into public record during a county hearing. When asked about the purpose of Unit C, no former staff could provide a clear answer. One retired orderly claimed it was used during cholera scares to isolate the infectious. Another said it was meant for patients with suicidal ideation, but no documentation existed for its operation. Its rooms were not assigned patient numbers. The ventilation system connected to no visible chimney or air shaft. And in the final room, investigators found scratch marks along the door's interior, arcing upward in erratic loops. This discovery reignited public outcry. Families who had long accepted the silence of the state now demanded names, explanations, and charges. A group of women whose sisters and daughters had vanished from the institute formed the Committee for the Unrecovered. They held vigils outside the courthouse, reading names aloud from Bronson's ledgers. Local merchants donated candles, farmers brought bread, but each week the momentum seemed to fade. Newspapers moved on to stories of industry and politics. The Relief League rebranded and shifted its focus to orphan care in Reading. Dr. Emery resigned from all public posts and was last seen boarding a steamer to Canada. No further arrests were made. No official apology was issued. In the months that followed the discovery of the subterranean corridor, access to the Bavarian Mental Institute was officially restricted. A perimeter fence was erected, and county guards were stationed at each entrance. Yet the site continued to attract visitors. Some came in mourning, clutching faded letters and daguerreotypes. Others came to watch. Students from Doylestown brought notebooks. A group of Philadelphia journalists camped outside the grounds for nearly a week, hoping for one last image before the state sealed the structure entirely. Inside, the work of cataloging continued. By early July, the Attorney General's archivists had inventoried more than 900 documents salvaged from the Institute's administrative offices. Most were routine: budget approvals, supply receipts, temperature logs. But buried among them was a slim volume labeled Restraint Authorization, 1895 to 1901. It contained a list of patient numbers, each followed by a date, initials of the attending physician, and a classification: I, L, or C. There was no key for these letters. Investigators would later speculate that they stood for isolation, lockdown, and containment. Of the patients marked C, not a single one appeared in the state's discharge database. Their records ended with the restraint order. This ledger, coupled with the excavation findings and the hidden corridor, formed the clearest evidence yet of a parallel system of confinement operating beneath the Institute's formal structure. It was not merely that patients had vanished. It was that certain patients had been deliberately funneled into a shadow register, withheld from family, and ultimately erased. No formal policy was ever found explaining how these decisions were made, but patterns emerged. Many C-marked patients shared specific traits. They were women who had accused staff of misconduct, men with political affiliations deemed disruptive, or immigrants who could not correspond fluently with family in English. One man, Joseph Machek, had been admitted in 1896 after confronting his employer about unpaid wages. His intake form listed paranoia toward authority as his diagnosis. Another, Clara Ansbach, had written 3 letters to the state school board accusing her pastor of impropriety. She was institutionalized 2 weeks later for unrelenting distress and preoccupations. The implication was staggering. The Bavarian Institute had not merely mistreated the sick, it had systematically absorbed the inconvenient. As this reality settled in, so did the silence from above. The Pennsylvania Department of Health released a single-page statement acknowledging historical failures in oversight and promising future procedural reforms. No follow-up occurred. The state legislature refused to open a special session. The Relief League, rebranded as the Family Care Association, donated $50 to each of the families identified in the investigation. No additional compensation was offered. For those most affected, this closure was hollow. In August 1908, Everett Bronson returned to the site alone. He brought with him a bundle of ribbons, each inscribed with the name of a missing patient. Over the course of a morning, he tied them to the rusted fence surrounding the western wing. Some had begun to fade. Others fluttered in the breeze like prayers unfinished. A reporter from the Philadelphia Herald photographed him through the bars. The image ran beneath the headline, "One Man, 76 Names." That same week, Bernice Waller published her final essay on the case in a small Quaker-run journal. It bore no title, only a date. In it she wrote, "What occurred at Bavarian cannot be explained by madness, by neglect, nor even by cruelty. It was the product of indifference institutionalized. A room built without windows, not to punish but to forget. There were no immediate responses to her essay, no editorials, no rebuttals. The silence was so complete it seemed staged. But below the surface the legacy began to splinter. 2 former nurses came forward in private to describe the conditions under which they had worked. One spoke of being instructed to withhold food from patients who spoke out of turn. Another recalled a patient who was found weeping in the garden, only to be led inside and never seen again. Neither woman was willing to speak publicly. They feared not legal reprisal, but professional ruin. One of them, in a letter to Waller, wrote, "You must understand this place did not threaten us, it simply absorbed us. It made the unnatural feel inevitable." By the end of that year, the Bavarian Mental Institute had become a subject too dense for conversation. Churches stopped referencing it, schools avoided the topic. Even local historians moved on to more palatable narratives. The ruins were left to rot, slowly overrun by ivy and damp. A group of boys broke in one autumn and found the stairwell to Unit C sealed with concrete. Another group in 1910 claimed to hear screaming from beneath the old infirmary, but no one investigated. The grounds became myth before they became memory. The families of the vanished held one last gathering. On the first Sunday of November, they met in a rented hall beside St. Paul's and read aloud every name from the intake books. 76 names, some full, some partial, some guessed from initials. No clergy officiated. No officials attended. At the end, each family lit a lantern and placed it in the field behind the hall. The wind was high. A few lanterns tipped, but most floated upward, flickering against the dusk. By winter, the story had vanished from public discourse. No plaques were placed, no memorial erected. The Bavarian Mental Institute faded into the dense grey of Pennsylvania winters, its walls still standing, but stripped of context. And yet, in small ways, the horror endured. Teachers who once praised the institute now avoided the subject entirely. Land surveys listed the property only as Parcel 46, disused. Former staff, when encountered, shifted tone or changed topic. And in one case, a funeral director in Yardley refused to embalm a body until he was assured it had no connection to Bavarian. The silence had shape now. It had ritual. It had limits that everyone understood, but no one stated. By 1911, the Bavarian Mental Institute no longer existed as a functioning entity, but its shadow still stretched across Bucks County. The main structure remained intact, roof lines jagged from neglect, shutters half-closed like eyelids refusing to open. Children dared each other to climb through the broken kitchen doors, and teenagers carved initials into the soft brick beside the chapel steps. But the place did not invite residents. It withheld sound. Birds avoided its eaves. The gravel drives remained untouched by carriage or boot. The land, officially state-owned after the Relief League's forfeiture of charter, became a jurisdictional ghost. The county refused to fund its maintenance. The state refused to classify it as historical. The lot was deemed unfit for commercial use due to lingering soil disruption. This phrase, extracted from an internal environmental review, became the polite euphemism passed between realtors and councilmen when the topic arose. In practice, no one would build on the land nor purchase it, nor speak of its eligibility without invoking an invisible weight. But in scattered homes and small-town libraries, the story of Bavarian had not yet gone to ground. Everett Bronson, now in his 60s, continued to compile records from families, seeking to fill the gaps that official channels would not touch. His notebooks, now faded and heavy with tape and pinholes, bore entries written in careful block script. Clara A., mother reported spring 1896, visit denied. Family told of relocation without address. Emile F., letter postmarked May 1897, handwriting inconsistent with earlier notes. Sonia R., intake form lists, episodes of laughter at improper times. Discharged, never. Status, unclear. Bronson never published a final volume. The story, he often said, was incomplete by nature. But he did donate copies of his notes to a small Lutheran college archive in Montgomery County. They were catalogued under private papers, mental health reform, unverified. The file sat untouched for decades, misfiled twice, nearly discarded once. It would not be rediscovered until 1968, when a graduate student researching 19th-century psychiatric architecture stumbled across Bronson's index. The student, Amy Thayer, copied 27 pages by hand and later submitted a paper titled The Forgotten Records of Institutional Absence. It was not published, but it kept the trail warm. Elsewhere, the Institute's remaining objects dispersed through the quiet channels of estate sales and institutional closures. A chair from the chapel reappeared in a Doylestown antique store with no provenance tag. A tiled basin believed to be from the hydrotherapy room was spotted at a Langhorne farmhouse used to chill cider. And in Bristol, a woman reported that a trunk purchased from a church rummage sale contained documents stamped "Retention Register" for internal use only. She burned them in her stove before reading more than a page. Each of these moments flickered briefly, then passed. Meanwhile, the land itself began to sink. By 1915, erosion had eaten away a third of the southern hillside. The remaining retaining walls near Jericho Creek collapsed after a spring flood, revealing wooden remnants and damp textiles embedded in the bank. The county ordered the slope filled with gravel and planted with pine. No excavation was approved. A crew of convicts laid the soil. They were told only that the ground was unstable and sensitive. Within a year, the vegetation grew thick and unreceptive. Bronson died in 1917. His obituary made no mention of the Institute. His records passed to a niece in Lancaster, who boxed them in a cellar where they remained for 36 years. Bernice Waller disappeared from the public eye shortly after her final essay. She moved west, married once, then again. Her writings on Bavarian were never reprinted. In her final letter to a colleague, she wrote, "History is not erased. It is placed in unreachable rooms." The last official correspondence regarding the Institute was filed in 1922, when a state senator proposed repurposing the site as a tuberculosis sanatorium. The proposal was withdrawn quietly after consultation with the Department of Public Health. No record was kept of the meeting. The notation beside the file reads simply, "Site carries stigma. Recommend alternative." And so the land endured without narrative. But memory, unlike land, requires no maintenance. In the late 1930s, two school teachers from Wrightstown began a project to collect regional folktales from students. One recurring story involved the garden under the hospital, where people were planted but never rose. Another described a staircase that grew deeper with every visit, swallowing voices. Most dismissed these stories as childish distortions, but one tale bore a name, Emery's Room. It described a windowless chamber where names were forgotten and doors were locked with songs no one could sing. The teachers filed the notes in a drawer labeled Mythology, but they mentioned it, quietly, in staff meetings. By the 1950s, aerial photographs of the Bavarian site revealed little more than overgrowth. The roof had collapsed inward, sections of the west wing had been overtaken by vines, and one chimney leaned 30 degrees south before finally giving way in a storm. The property was fenced once more, this time with barbed wire and posted with state no-entry signs. Yet trespassers persisted. In 1959, a boy disappeared for 11 hours after entering the property with friends. He was found sleeping in a depression beside the old carriage road, mouth filled with dirt. He would not speak for 2 days. When he did, he said only, "They kept calling my name, but I don't have one." His mother moved the family to Pittsburgh. No report was filed. In 1962, a highway planning committee commissioned a feasibility study to expand Route 413 through Bucks County, potentially running through the land once held by the Bavarian Mental Institute. Survey teams were dispatched that spring. Their task was routine: soil integrity analysis, water table depth, environmental disruption forecasts. Most parcels passed with minimal remark, but when they reached the Bavarian tract, the report stalled. Not due to topography, but personnel. 2 soil technicians walked off the job after their first afternoon on the site. According to internal memos, both refused to return. One cited dizziness and disorientation, the other feeling observed from below. Their supervisor dismissed the incidents as fatigue. Replacement crews were sent. They encountered no mechanical problems, but their notes reflected mounting unease. Measurements near the western edge yielded inconsistent readings, as if the Earth was layered over something hollow. Ground-penetrating radar, still experimental at the time, was deployed briefly. It detected anomalies beneath what had once been the garden terraces. The machines registered voids where there should have been packed loam. The anomalies were labeled unexplained substructural cavities. No further excavation was attempted. Our revised route bypassed the tract by 2 miles. The land was left untouched, but its reputation deepened. In the 1970s, a movement emerged among psychiatric historians to re-evaluate the legacy of early American asylums, most focused on urban institutions with well-documented abuses. Yet a small cluster of researchers became intrigued by the absence of documentation surrounding Bavarian. Among them was Dr. Naomi Herrick, a clinical psychologist who taught part-time at Temple University and spent summers combing county archives. In 1974, Herrick discovered a set of patient intake cards from the Bavarian facility filed under a mislabeled box in the state's Department of Public Welfare. The cards were brittle, water-stained, and incomplete, but the handwriting matched the ledgers Bronson had once compiled. On several cards, beside dates and diagnoses, appeared faint initials, CEW. Some bore only a stamped number. Herrick followed these threads as far as she could. Many of the families had died or relocated. Few were willing to speak. One woman, whose aunt had been institutionalized in 1897, agreed to meet but cancelled the morning of the interview. Her final note read, "We buried her again already. Please don't dig." Herrick's work remained unpublished. When she submitted a proposal for a monograph on the Institute's operations, her publisher declined. One editor wrote, "There is no central event here, only whispers. This is a haunted house without a ghost." Herrick shelved her manuscript. She died in 1981, her notes dispersed among university archives, yet fragments remained. In 1987, a structural engineer performing survey work for a nearby county park stumbled upon the northern retaining wall of the Institute's chapel foundation. He had no knowledge of its history. When he inquired about its demolition schedule, a local official informed him that the site is classified for non-development. He asked why. The official paused, then replied, "Families don't want us to." The engineer moved on. That same year, a group of local volunteers from a genealogy society began compiling lost cemeteries of Bucks County. When they came to the Bavarian site, they found no registry, no maps, no headstones. One member brought an old map printed in 1902, showing dotted lines along the southern edge labeled Garden Expansion, not formalized. Another brought Bronson's pamphlet, photocopied from a university archive. For several weeks, the volunteers searched the perimeter, placing flags where anomalies appeared in soil contour. They logged 43 distinct depressions. They submitted their findings to the county council. There was no response. By the turn of the century, the Bavarian tract was more legend than location. Children no longer snuck through its gates. Fencing had collapsed. Wild fennel overtook the front walk. Ivy consumed what remained of the West Wing's stonework. Occasionally, hikers found fragments, a rusted door hinge, a porcelain tooth, a brick stamped with the letter B. These relics never stayed in circulation. Some were returned to the site. Others were thrown into the creek. In 2003, a graduate thesis from a student at Lehigh University reignited brief interest. Titled Unrecorded Burials and Institutional Margins, it re-examined the Bavarian case using modern forensic models. The student, Caroline DeWitt, projected a burial count of at least 70 individuals based on cross-referenced intake logs, soil anomalies, and missing persons reports from the period. Her estimate did not include undocumented admissions. DeWitt requested access to the site for soil coring. The county denied the request. Still, her thesis circulated among archivists and amateur historians. In 2007, an independent filmmaker from New Jersey visited the property to film a documentary segment. The footage was minimal, panning shots of broken gates, slow zooms on moss-covered stones, ambient wind through the chapel debris. The filmmaker, Gregory Lantz, recorded narration later, quoting Bronson and Waller. The short film aired once at a regional history festival. Our copy was posted online, where it circulated briefly before disappearing. When asked about a follow-up project, Lance declined. "There's no audience for absence," he said. In 2014, an application was submitted to the County Planning Board to turn the Bavarian land into a solar field. It was withdrawn before the second hearing. One planning officer, interviewed anonymously, claimed that several local families voiced strong generational objections. Their reasoning was not environmental, it was genealogical. Some, he said, simply wanted the land to remain untouched, as penance or preservation, depending who you asked. As of 2025, the Bavarian mental institute's remains still sit beneath vines and soil, crumbling in deliberate obscurity. There is no signage, no guided tours. The name does not appear on county directories. The only public mention is a single line in the Bucks Historical Society's index: Bavarian Mental Institute, 1892-1908. See Relief League Project. See also Early State Asylums, Patient Outcomes Unknown. And yet among certain families, names are still spoken. Photographs are still passed, folded, preserved in the backs of hymnals. Some relatives gather quietly each October. Not to protest, not to demand justice, but to sit, to remember, to hold names in the open air. They do not mark the ground with crosses. They do not dig. They do not need to. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.